The night was quiet. Ethan sat alone inside his small outpost on the edge of a barren planet. The human colony was miles away, and he was the only one stationed here for research. The wind howled outside, carrying dust and sand across the lifeless landscape. It was just another ordinary night, or so he thought. Then came the sound. A sharp knock echoed from the metal door. Ethan froze. Nobody ever visited his outpost. The colony had strict rules. No one traveled at night, and there were no patrols in this area. His heartbeat quickened. Was it an animal? A malfunction in the system? Or something worse? Slowly, he stood up, grabbing the old rifle from the table. He moved toward the door and checked the small screen that showed the outside camera feed. His breath caught in his throat. A figure stood in the darkness, barely visible under the weak red lights of the outpost. It was tall, slender, and covered in armor-like skin that shimmered under the dusty wind. It wasn't human. An alien. Ethan's fingers tightened around his weapon. Encounters with aliens were rare in this sector, and most of them weren't friendly. But something was wrong. The figure was swaying, struggling to stand. It collapsed against the door. For a few moments, Ethan hesitated. Letting an unknown alien inside could be a death sentence, but leaving it out there, it would die for sure. He took a deep breath, placed his weapon aside, though still within reach, and pressed the button to unlock the door. With a soft hiss, the metal door slid open, and the alien fell into his arms. Ethan barely managed to hold her up. She was lighter than he expected, but her body was covered in strange cuts and burns. Her breathing was weak. Up close, he could see her face. She was oddly human-like, with high cheekbones, silver blue skin, and deep violet eyes. But there was pain in those eyes, exhaustion, and something else. Desperation. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was soft, but heavy with emotion. "Just one night." Ethan didn't understand. "What?" She tried to speak again, but collapsed, unconscious. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, his mind racing. Who was she? Why was she here? And what did she mean by just one night? But questions could wait. She wouldn't survive much longer without help. With effort, Ethan carried her inside and laid her on the old cot in the corner. His hands moved automatically, grabbing his first aid kit. He had treated injuries before, mostly his own, from accidents while working on machines. But this was different. Her skin had a strange texture, like soft metal, and her wounds didn't bleed like a human's. Still, he did his best. He cleaned her wounds, applied a healing gel, and wrapped the deeper cuts with bandages. Her breathing steadied, but she remained unconscious. Ethan sat down beside her, watching her carefully. Who was she running from? Why did she come here, of all places? And why did she ask for just one night? Outside, the wind howled again, but inside the small outpost, it was quiet. For now, Ethan sat near the cot, watching the mysterious alien woman as she slept. Her breathing had stabilized, but her body still looked weak. The strange silver-blue texture of her skin shimmered under the dim lights of the outpost. Who was she? Where had she come from? And most importantly, why had she come here? Outside, the wind howled against the metal walls, but inside, everything was quiet except for the soft rhythm of her breath. Ethan ran a hand through his messy brown hair. He had been alone at this outpost for months. No visitors, no real excitement, until now. Suddenly, she stirred. Her violet eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she looked around in confusion before her gaze landed on Ethan. She tried to sit up, but pain made her wince. "Careful," Ethan said, raising a hand. "You were in bad shape when I found you." She looked at the bandages on her arms, and then back at him. There was something unreadable in her expression. Distrust, relief, and something else. Sadness. "Where am I?" she finally asked. "My research outpost. About 30 miles from the main colony," Ethan replied. "You collapsed outside my door. You're lucky I found you in time." She sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. Then, as if remembering something urgent, she suddenly grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak but desperate. "I don't have much time," she whispered. Ethan frowned. "Time for what?" She hesitated, then finally spoke. "My name is Lyra. I was a warrior of the Valkyrie." Ethan's eyes widened. He had heard of the Valkyrie before. They were a race of powerful, engineered warriors, created for war and destruction. But their creators had betrayed them, seeing them as obsolete. Instead of allowing them to live freely, the creators hunted them down, wiping out almost all of them. "But the Valkyrie are nearly extinct," Ethan said slowly. She nodded. "I am one of the last. My people are gone. My home is gone. And now, they are hunting me too." Ethan swallowed. So she was being chased. That meant whoever was after her might come here next. His peaceful, quiet life had just turned into something dangerous. "Why here?" he asked. "Why did you come to my outpost?" Her grip on his wrist tightened. "Because before I die, I want to live." Ethan felt a strange chill run through him. "I don't understand." Liara took a deep breath. "All my life, I have only known war. I was created to fight, trained to kill, and ordered to obey. I never knew peace, never knew what it felt like to be free." She looked at him with tired eyes. "I don't want to die as just a soldier. I want to experience what it's like to be alive, even if just for one night." Ethan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't asking for help to fight back or escape. She was asking for something much more human. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with silence except for the faint hum of the outpost's generator. Ethan sighed. "What do you want to do?" Liara seemed surprised by the question. She had spent so long fighting that she never imagined she'd have a choice. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't even know what it means to just live." Ethan stood up, thinking for a moment. Then he extended his hand toward her. "Well, I guess tonight we'll find out together." Liara hesitated before placing her hand in his. Her fingers were rough from battle, but her touch was surprisingly gentle. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly across the dark sky, and for the first time in her life, Lyra wasn't running. She was simply living. The outpost was small, barely enough for one person to live comfortably, but tonight it felt different. The air was heavier, filled with an unspoken weight between Ethan and Lyra. She had spent her entire life as a soldier, fighting battles that were never her own, always under someone else's command. But now, for the first time, she had a choice. Ethan moved toward the small cooking unit in the corner of the outpost. He wasn't much of a chef. Most of his meals were just ration packs from the colony, but he figured Lyra had never experienced something as simple as a warm meal made for her. "You ever tried human food before?" he asked as he started preparing a basic stew. Lyra, still sitting on the cot, tilted her head. "No, our food was created for efficiency, not taste." Ethan chuckled. "Sounds awful." It was. She glanced around the outpost, taking in the little details. Tools scattered across the table, a half-read book on the shelf, and a small picture frame with a photo of Earth. "This place. It's not much, but it feels peaceful." Ethan shrugged. "It's quiet, that's for sure. Not much happens here. Before you arrived, my biggest problem was a broken water filter." Lyra's lips curled slightly, almost a smile. "That sounds nice." He glanced at her. The way she looked around, the way she touched the fabric of the cot, as if she had never felt something so soft before. It made him realize just how different their lives had been. A short silence passed before Lyra spoke again. "What is Earth like?" Ethan paused, then leaned against the counter. "It's beautiful. Blue skies, green forests, oceans that stretch forever. It's home." His voice softened. "Been years since I last saw it, though." Liara listened carefully. You miss it. Yeah, Ethan admitted. But I guess, in a way, this place became home too. Even if it's not perfect. She looked down at her hands. I never had a home. The words hung in the air for a moment. Ethan didn't know how to respond, so he did the only thing he could. He set 2 bowls of stew on the table and gestured for her to join him. Lara hesitated before standing up and walking over. She picked up the spoon and studied the food with curiosity. Carefully, she took a small bite. Her violet eyes widened slightly. This is warm. Ethan smirked. That's usually how soup works. She took another bite, slower this time, as if savoring the unfamiliar sensation. For someone who had spent her entire life knowing nothing but war, something as simple as a hot meal was an entirely new experience. As they ate, Ethan found himself forgetting the danger outside. He forgot about the possibility that someone might be hunting her. In this small outpost, under the dim lights, it was just 2 people sharing a quiet moment. After they finished, Liara leaned back in her chair, looking more relaxed than before. Thank you. For what? Ethan asked. For this. For treating me like a person, not just a warrior. She looked down at her hands. I was never given that. Ethan exhaled slowly. You deserve it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind outside had settled, leaving a deep silence in the air. Then Lara asked, what do humans do for fun? Ethan raised an eyebrow. You mean, besides working and eating? She gave him a pointed look. He grinned. All right. Well, there's music, games, stories. He walked over to a small storage box, rummaged through it, and pulled out a holo player. He placed it on the table and pressed a button. A soft melody filled the room, a slow and calming tune. Liara listened, her expression unreadable. Music, Ethan said. Some people say it's the language of the soul. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to memorize the sound. It's beautiful. Ethan watched her. There was something about seeing someone experience ordinary things for the first time that made them feel special again. You can dance to it too, he said. Liara opened her eyes, tilting her head. Dance. He stood up and extended his hand. Come on, I'll show you. She hesitated, looking at his hand like it was a completely alien concept, because to her it was. But after a moment, she reached out, letting him guide her to her feet. Ethan placed her hand in his and gently moved to the rhythm of the music. Liara was stiff at first, unsure of what to do. But slowly, she relaxed, letting herself move with him. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about survival. She wasn't thinking about war or running. For the first time, she was simply living. The music played softly in the background, filling the small outpost with a warmth that neither Ethan nor Lara had expected. She had never danced before, never even considered it. For someone raised in battle, movement had always meant dodging, striking, or running. But here she was, standing close to a human, letting the music guide her instead of orders. Ethan kept his movements slow, letting her adjust. You're doing fine, he said with a small smile. Liara's violet eyes flickered with something unreadable. It feels strange. He chuckled. Strange good or strange bad? She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Strange. Peaceful. They moved together in the dim light, the wind outside whispering against the walls. Ethan had always thought of this outpost as lonely, a place of isolation. But with Liara here, it felt different. It felt alive. After a while, Liara gently pulled away. I think that's enough dancing for me, she said, her voice quieter than before. Ethan nodded, stepping back. No problem. You did great. She glanced at the small table where the remains of their meal sat. I don't understand something, Ethan. He leaned against the counter. What's that? You knew I was dangerous. You knew I could bring trouble here. And yet, you still helped me. You still gave me food, talked to me, danced with me. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with unspoken questions. Why? Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Maybe because I've spent too long out here alone. Maybe because I saw someone who didn't deserve to be left out in the cold. He shrugged. Or maybe I just wanted to. Liara studied him for a long moment. Where I come from, kindness like yours is rare. Well, where I come from, letting people suffer when you can help is just wrong. Silence filled the space between them. Then, Lyra let out a breath and walked toward the window. Outside, the barren landscape stretched into the distance, silver under the pale light of distant stars. I always thought I would die in battle, she admitted. That I would fall with a weapon in my hand, surrounded by enemies. She turned to look at him. But tonight, I lived. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Then let's make this night last as long as we can. Lyra's expression softened. She sat down on the cot, looking more relaxed than before. Tell me more about Earth, she said. Ethan smiled. All right. Let's see. Have I told you about the oceans? And so, he talked. He told her about the endless blue waves, about forests so thick the sunlight barely touched the ground. He described cities glowing with lights, laughter echoing through the streets. Lyra listened to every word as if trying to capture the image in her mind, holding on to something she had never known. As the night went on, their voices grew softer, their words slower. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the outpost, there was only warmth. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel alone. And for the first time in her life, Lyra felt free. The night outside was calm, a rare stillness in the otherwise unpredictable landscape. Inside the outpost, the dim light flickered softly, casting shadows against the metal walls. Lyra sat near the window, her gaze locked onto the distant horizon. The stars above seemed endless, stretching far beyond what the human eye could comprehend. Ethan sat across from her, leaning back in his chair, watching her carefully. He had never seen an alien like her before, not just in appearance, but in spirit. She carried something within her, something more than just a warrior's instinct. There was longing. What are you thinking about? He asked finally. Lyra blinked and turned to him, her violet eyes reflecting the soft glow of the outpost lights. Freedom, she answered. For the first time, I feel it. Ethan nodded, understanding more than he let on. And what does it feel like? She hesitated, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you could either fly or fall. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, that's freedom, all right. It's scary because you don't know what's next. Lyra studied him, a small, unreadable smile on her lips. Humans fear the unknown, yet they walk toward it without hesitation. Ethan chuckled. Not always. But yeah, we tend to be stubborn like that. She leaned forward slightly, her expression turning serious. If I leave here, my people will find me. And when they do, they will either kill me or drag me back to a life I no longer want. Ethan sat up. Then don't go back. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Hope, doubt, conflict. It's not that simple, Ethan. They won't just let me disappear. He leaned his arms on the table, his voice steady. Then we'll make sure they don't find you. Lyra's eyes widened slightly. We? Ethan shrugged. I'm not letting you go back to a life you don't want. Not when you have a choice. She shook her head. You don't understand. They will hunt me across planets if they must. I was important to them. Ethan frowned. Because of your warrior status. A bitter smile crossed her face. Because I was meant to be something more. A leader. A symbol of strength. She looked away. But I don't want to be a weapon anymore, Ethan. Silence settled between them. The quiet hum of the outpost's generator was the only sound. Ethan took a deep breath. Then we fight for something else. Lyra met his gaze. And what would that be? He smiled. A life where you get to choose what you want. Not one where others decide for you. She exhaled slowly, processing his words. And what if I don't know what I want yet? Then you figure it out along the way, he said simply. For the first time since they met, Lyra let out a small, genuine laugh. It was soft, barely audible, but real. You make it sound so easy, she said. Ethan grinned. It never is. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. Lyra's gaze softened. The idea of choosing her own path was something she had never dared to consider before. But now, sitting here in this quiet outpost, with a human who had no reason to help her yet chose to anyway, she felt something unfamiliar growing inside her. Hope. She stood up and walked toward the window again. Outside, the darkness stretched infinitely, yet for the first time, it didn't seem frightening. If I stay, it will bring danger to you, she said. Ethan shrugged. I've had worse. She turned back to him, searching his face. You don't even know what you're getting yourself into. Maybe not, he admitted. But I know I'm not letting you go back to a life you don't want. Lyra stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding. Then I'll stay, she whispered. Outside, the stars continued to shine, indifferent to the small promise made beneath them. But for Lyra and Ethan, that promise meant everything. The quiet promise under the stars didn't last long. By the next morning, Ethan knew their time was running out. The stolen signal he intercepted last night confirmed it. Lyra's people were coming. He stood at the control panel of the outpost, staring at the radar. The red blips on the screen were unmistakable. A small fleet was already in the system, scanning the surface. They found us, he muttered. Lyra, standing behind him, tensed. She didn't need to look at the screen to know what was coming. I told you they wouldn't stop. Ethan exhaled sharply. Then we better not be here when they land. She stepped forward. No, Ethan, you should leave. They don't want you. They'd want me. Ethan turned to her, eyes filled with determination. Not happening. She clenched her fists. You don't understand. My people are warriors. They are trained to hunt fugitives. If you stay, you'll die. Ethan smirked. I've been through worse. Lyra shook her head in frustration. Why are you doing this? I'm just an alien woman running from her past. This isn't your fight. Ethan sighed. Maybe it isn't. But I made a choice. Lyra, you said you wanted freedom. You deserve a chance at it. For a moment, she didn't speak. The weight of his words settled in her chest. No one had ever fought for her before. Ethan turned back to the controls and started typing. I'm sending a false distress signal to one of the abandoned stations on the other side of the planet. If we're lucky, they'll think we're there and waste time searching. Lyra watched him work, something unexplainable stirring inside her. Humans, they never back down, even when the odds were impossible. A beeping sound interrupted her thoughts. Ethan's plan had barely started, but the enemy fleet was too fast. They're landing, he said, his voice tight. Lyra's stomach sank. Then we run. The escape. The two of them rushed out of the outpost and toward Ethan's old hovercraft. The vehicle was beaten up, but still functional. Ethan hopped into the pilot's seat while Lyra climbed in beside him. As soon as the engines roared to life, the radar lit up with new signals. The enemy's scout drones were already searching for them. We need a distraction, Lyra said, gripping the dashboard. Ethan smirked and flipped a switch. A series of explosives buried around the outpost. His backup plan detonated at once. Boom! A massive cloud of fire and smoke erupted behind them, shaking the ground. The enemy drones immediately turned toward the explosion. Lyra's eyes widened. You planned this. Ethan grinned. Always have a backup plan. The hovercraft shot forward, racing across the rocky terrain. Lyra turned her gaze to the sky. The enemy dropships were descending. It wouldn't be long before they realized the trick. We need to get off this planet, she said. Ethan nodded. There's an old cargo ship hidden about 30 miles from here. If we make it there before they catch us, we're golden. Lyra glanced at him. And if we don't? Ethan smirked. Then we improvise. She shook her head in disbelief. Humans and their madness. The pursuit. Minutes passed as they sped through the wastelands. The terrain was rough, but Ethan handled the craft like he had been doing it all his life. Then the alarms blared. "They're onto us," Ethan muttered, looking at the radar. A squad of enemy fighters was closing in. Liara gritted her teeth. "They won't stop until I'm captured." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Then we make sure they don't get that chance." He gripped the controls and suddenly veered left, taking the hovercraft down into a narrow canyon. The sharp turns made it difficult for their pursuers to lock on. Liara pressed against her seat as the hovercraft dodged rocks and cliffs. "Are you even a pilot?" she shouted over the roaring wind. Ethan laughed. "Nope, just good at not dying." She couldn't believe it. This human was insane. Behind them, the enemy fighters struggled to follow, crashing into the canyon walls one by one. But one ship remained, its weapons locking onto them. "They're going to fire," Liara warned. Ethan's fingers flew over the controls. "Not if I do this." He suddenly killed the engines, making the hovercraft drop like a stone. The enemy fighter overshot them, losing its lock. Liara's breath caught in her throat as Ethan reactivated the engines just before they hit the ground. The craft jolted but remained intact. The enemy pilot, realizing his mistake, tried to turn around, but it was too late. The narrow canyon didn't give him enough space. Crash! The fighter exploded against the rocks, sending debris raining down. Liara turned to Ethan, stunned. That was either the smartest or dumbest thing I've ever seen. Ethan grinned. Bit of both. She let out a breath. He was reckless. He was unpredictable. But most of all, he was keeping her alive. The final stretch. With the enemy ships gone, Ethan pushed the hovercraft toward their destination. In the distance, a rusty cargo ship sat hidden between the cliffs. "There she is," Ethan said. "Our ticket out of here." But Liara didn't relax. "They'll send more." Ethan nodded. "Then we better move fast." As they reached the cargo ship, Liara hesitated for a moment. She looked at the sky, knowing that her people would never stop hunting her. Then she looked at Ethan, the human who risked everything for her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running alone. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the ship. Their fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, she had hope. The cargo ship loomed before them, a massive rusted relic hidden between the cliffs. It was old, but if it could fly even once more, it would be their only hope. Ethan jumped out of the hovercraft and ran to the ship's entrance panel. The controls were ancient, covered in dust and corrosion. He wiped them clean and started working. Liara stood behind him, scanning the skies. She could feel it. Her people were coming. The moment of escape was slipping through their fingers. "Hurry, Ethan," she urged, gripping her weapon. Ethan didn't look up. His fingers moved fast, bypassing the security codes. Almost there, just a little more. Then the sky lit up with fire. A massive warship broke through the clouds, descending fast. The ground trembled under its weight. From its belly, dozens of soldiers dropped onto the terrain. "They're here," Liara whispered. "No more running." Ethan cursed under his breath. The cargo ship's systems were still booting up. "We need more time," he muttered. Liara stepped forward, eyes hard. "Then I'll buy us some." Ethan's head snapped up. "What? No, that's suicide." She turned to him, her expression calm. "This is my fight, Ethan. My people won't stop unless I face them." He clenched his jaw. "And if they take you?" Liara exhaled. "Then at least you get away." Ethan slammed his fist against the ship's controls. "Not happening." She looked at him, the stubborn human who had risked everything for her. Her heart pounded. She had spent her whole life obeying, accepting her fate. But now, she had something worth fighting for. She grabbed Ethan's arm. "Then we fight together." He smirked. "Now you're talking." The battle begins. The first wave of enemy soldiers stormed toward them. Liara and Ethan took cover behind the ship's landing gear. Blaster fire erupted. The night sky flashed with streaks of red and blue as both sides exchanged fire. Ethan picked off enemies with precise shots, while Liara fought like a warrior born. She moved fast, dodging blasts, her strikes swift and deadly. But more soldiers came. Too many. Ethan reloaded. We're outnumbered. Liara's voice was steady. Then we make them regret coming. She lunged, taking down an enemy in hand-to-hand combat. Ethan followed her lead, throwing everything he had into the fight. But then, a shadow loomed over them, the enemy commander. The last confrontation. A tall, armored figure stepped forward. General Kaler, Liara's father. His cold eyes locked onto her. Daughter. Liara froze. She hadn't seen him in years, but his voice still held the weight of command. You've run long enough, Kaler said. Surrender. Ethan aimed his blaster. Not happening. Kaler ignored him. Liara, return home. End this foolishness. Liara's hands shook. She had spent her life under his control. A warrior, a tool for war, never free. She took a deep breath. No. Kaler's expression darkened. Then you are no daughter of mine. He raised his weapon, but Ethan moved first. He fired, hitting Kaler's shoulder. The general staggered but didn't fall. Liara charged forward. Kaler swung at her, but she dodged. With one swift movement, she knocked his weapon aside and pinned him down. Liara, Kaler growled. She stared into his eyes. She wasn't afraid anymore. You don't control me, she said. With that, she turned away. She had made her choice. Freedom. Ethan shouted from the ship. Liara, get in. She sprinted toward him as the engines roared to life. The ship was ready. As she jumped inside, the doors sealed behind her. Ethan ran to the controls and punched the launch sequence. The enemy soldiers fired at them, but it was too late. The cargo ship lifted off. Through the window, Liara saw Kaler standing below, watching as she disappeared into the sky. For the first time in her life, she was free. The journey ahead. As the stars stretched before them, Liara turned to Ethan. You never gave up on me, she said. He smiled. Guess I'm just stubborn. She chuckled. Then, softly, she said, thank you. Ethan leaned back in his seat. So, where to? Liara looked out at the endless stars. The universe was open to them now. She smiled. Anywhere but back. The end.